Our guest today has achieved an impressive array of accomplishments, and to a class of young emerging OCA students in 1970, the role of gallery owner and collector were most notable. The David Mirvish Gallery was like no other space in the country. Upon entering, the gallery transported you into a virtual chapel of light. The combination of architecture and art melding into a level of sophistication that was spiritually enlightening and intellectually rigorous. At the gallery, David had created a culture of education and accessibility. As young art students, we were not only welcomed but encouraged by David and his staff in the most generous way to engage with the artists and the work that they exhibited. There we met important historical figures, such as Robert Motherwell, Helen Frankenthaler, Jules Zalitsky, and Jack Bush. There we embraced the cutting-edge practice of Frank Stella and assisted in installations of his work. The paintings we were exposed to, these large-scale, big attack paintings, were of extraordinary quality. To generations of both emerging and established artists, this work raised the bar of expectation. Now we knew what a great painting looked like. Now we knew what we had to compete with. And as artists, now we knew what we had to do. My own work was fueled and propelled by this experience. And in 1975, I was visited in my studio by David. He looked carefully at the work and asked, "Would you like to be represented by my gallery?" Well, I remember the feeling to this day. It was truly over the moon. I felt like I had just made the Toronto Maple Leafs. And I couldn't wait to tell my mom. David provided us with a level of education at the gallery that could rarely be supplied by an institution. The fact that the gallery was more of a museum than a marketplace made this possible. And I am pleased to say that I am still encouraged to visit David's private collection with my abstract painting students. Today, I personally would like to add the role of art educator to David's impressive achievements and to ask you in joining in welcoming our guest David Mirvish to OCAD University.
Thanks very much, Paul. So thanks all of you for coming today. It's great to see so many of you from our classes. We're supposed to be comfortable here.
We'll grow to it.
We're not as comfortable as we look, but it's going to work. Anyway, Paul and I thought it would be a wonderful occasion to bring David into this combined class. As Paul said, we've both known David for a very long time. We've had tremendous experiences in our own lives through David's efforts with his gallery. And I think that it's a good moment to, as we draw closer between OCAD and David's collections, as we start to draw closer, to have a time to get to know David a bit better, to realize what he was up to with his gallery, and to look at some things. We will be showing some, you don't have to look at these pictures all day. Paul will be in charge of showing some images which have come out of David's, mostly out of the gallery, or if not out of the gallery, then they're from artists who have been shown in the gallery. So I'd like to set the stage by going back to 1963, if I could. David Mirvish is, tell me if I've got this right, David Mirvish is finishing high school. All of his friends are heading off to college, but David decides he's going to open an art gallery instead. I got that right?
You got it right, yeah, that's right.
Now, what happens next? You go to New York, put on a suit and tie.
I was trying to bum off. Today you would be able to say, I finished high school, I want to take a year off, and I'm going to go to Europe, and then I'll come back and go to university. But in the early 60s, that was a turning point. If you think of the end of the 50s and the man in the gray flannel suit and Eisenhower, and then you come along to 61 and you have Camelot with the Kennedys, and an age of enormous optimism that begins to open up, changes socially that are radical. And I wanted to take a year off, but I knew I couldn't just say I'm going to take a year off. My mother went for 6 months to New York to study at the New School. And she studied with Tom Doyle, who was a sculptor, who was living with his wife at the time was Eva Hess. And their best friend was Lee Bonnecue. And my mother went out to Siegel's Farm and went to the Capro happenings. So she was taking my father through museums and showing him Rauschenberg's bed on the wall. And he was getting restless with it. And so my father bought the Royal Alexandra Theatre, and my mother decided to come home. She felt that she could find people to talk to. And she had felt in Toronto she couldn't find people to talk to. And so her coming home and me wanting to not go to school for a year, I said, Mom, I've got $1,800. I found a place for $300 a month. I'm going to be an art dealer. It was hard for her to complain about it. And I turned to my father and I said, the rent's $300 a month, and I'm going to be a merchant. And that solved the problem. I thought I'll sit in the back room, I'll read Moby Dick. And in another year, I'll go back to school. The problem with it was that I hadn't thought it through far enough. I knew a couple of artists. One of them was Les Levine, and he said, why don't you go see Leo Castelli for your first show and see if you can borrow pictures from him. I didn't know Leo, and I was 18. I was about to turn 19. So I said to a woman who was in marketing in Honest Ed's that this suggestion had been made and I'd like to do it, but I didn't know how to go about it. And she said, Leo's my cousin. No problem. Yeah. I'll write you a letter of introduction. You make an appointment. So Casey Messenger wrote this letter. I made the appointment. I went, gave the letter to Leo. I said, Leo, I'd like to, he read the letter. He said, young man, what can I do for you? I said, well, I'd like to open a gallery with an exhibition of your artists. He said, well, actually, there's another gallery opening in Toronto, the Del Junco Morris Gallery, and I've promised to show all my artists there. But Ivan Karp, who's down the hall, you should talk to him. He's working in my gallery, and he's discovered some more artists. So I spoke to Ivan, and he showed me some pictures by Walker Everett. And every picture was so bad, it couldn't be an accident. It had to be on purpose. So I said, may I take 2 of those, please, sir? And then they offered me a picture by Hefferton, who had done women in corsets. Corsets were going to be an artifact of history. You had to have pictures of corsets. They were going to document a moment in time. So I took 2 of those, and a painting by Mel Ramos of Black Hawk. And now I had my opening exhibition, and all I needed was some way to announce it. And the National Gallery had just fired Alan Jarvis. He had had the temerity to try and buy a Bruegel and a Bacon and a third picture, I don't remember, from the Prince of Liechtenstein. And the National Gallery's pictures were all paid for at that time by Parliament. And Parliament didn't back his purchase, so he quit. So I asked Alan if he would say a few words, and I served hot dogs and popcorn, and we were off and running. But before we moved to that slide, the important thing about the slide behind us isn't that that's what you're going to look like if you don't die at 30, which is, but it's that it's the first rule of looking at painting. If you're going to look at paintings in the 60s, they had to know, take the sunglasses off. Okay, we can move to the next one.
Okay, that was the A materials.
Yeah, that's as good as it gets. Okay, so we're at the opening on your left, and the end of the first year on the right. So you can see I didn't know where I was going or what I was doing in the first year, but it was great because I didn't have anybody coming in to bother me to buy pictures. Occasionally people came in and said, "What is this stuff you've chosen to put on the wall?" You had to defend it, and you had to think it through. And why were you showing what you were showing? But at the end of the first year, I did a group show, and somehow in that group show, there's a bush that came up in it, And it was a moment when the AGO was also showing post-painterly abstraction, an exhibition from Los Angeles that had a wide range of abstract artists put together by Clement Greenberg. And Jack came into the gallery and showed his picture to Clem. And I had a discussion with him. And you can see that it was a tiny gallery, so I hung everything about 4 inches apart. I wanted, to get as much stuff in as I could. And this show had a couple of, it had de Kooning, a couple of Hoffmans, a Francis Bacon, a Louise Nevelson, a big Wesselman, a lot of things. It was a hodgepodge. It was 29 international artists, and they had all appeared in a magazine called Art International from Lugano the previous 12 months. And they'd have been the people who appeared the most. And then from this, I jumped into going to Venice, which was the summer of '64. And the artists I'm still interested in are Johns and Rauschenberg. Those are the most exciting artists. And the Americans are represented by Johns, Rauschenberg, Jim Dine, Frank Stella, Rosenquist, and in the Biennale grounds, 2 artists I didn't really know, Morris Lewis and Kenneth Nolan. And I went to all of this stuff as a young person, excited to be part of something, and I knew a couple of people that had some interesting experiences in Venice. But when I came away from it, that experience of having the bush, and tucked behind is an Olitsky called Orange Column in one of the pictures. And it sort of stood out, and I had never heard of this artist. He was only in the show because the gallery that showed him had Diebenkorn. And I went to Ellie Poindexter and I said, I'd like a Diebenkorn. And she said, take this Olitsky with you. And so I hung it with it. And it was sort of the standout picture of the whole exhibition for me. So it raised a lot of questions. Why this artist that I didn't know or hadn't heard of amongst all these famous artists was standing out? And when I came back from Venice, it was quite an exciting time. Leo spoke Italian and was able to persuade the judges to look at the Americans. It was the first time an American had won in Venice since Whistler. So Rauschenberg won the grand prize. But the paintings I remembered were the Nolans and the Lewises, because they were not Cubist space. They were a different way of composing, different way of making art. And what to me was quite radical. And they got me to the point where I thought, no, I'm not going back to university. I'm going to follow this and try and figure it out. Why are these people more interesting to me? Why is one painting better than another? What's going on?
Well, yes, you've answered one of the questions that I was going to ask you about. Since it's a fairly rare occasion where we have an art gallery owner here with us and an artist, so I thought it would be a good time to talk about the relationship that an artist has with their gallery. Now, a lot of you would like to have a career in painting and will be graduating and looking for a gallery, looking for a gallery owner to represent your work to the world. And I think we probably have some experience we could share with them relative to how a gallery chooses the artist they're going to show. You've said quite a bit about that already. And then the relationship, it's very important, the relationship between the artist and their gallery. And a lot can go wrong, let's say, if you don't have a good relationship. So, and it's quite critical to having a satisfying career, I believe.
Yeah, the eternal search for your Kahnweiler. Kahnweiler was Picasso's dealer. And he stood by him in periods that he didn't like and in the periods he did like. That's different than dating. That's a marriage. It's hard to find that marriage, but having a dealer is a wonderful plus in the sense that there's someone else who is saying you're wonderful rather than you're saying it. You know, there's someone out there who's there for you, who's able to speak to people, who has access sometimes to a world that you don't always have access to, because if they're showing 6 or 7 artists and the curator is interested in one of them, he might say, well, what is this person interested in? Why is he showing an artist I'm interested in? What else does he show? So you have a chance to connect to a broad area and number of people as a dealer, more than a single artist does, and that's a function that a gallery can provide. On the other hand, it's a business relationship, and it should be set up in a fairly formal business-like way, I believe, from the start. All of my relationships were without, occasionally we had a form of a written contract. We had an agreement about something where I was, buying some pictures against sales or doing something specific or providing something of a livelihood for some of our artists. But if you're consigning pictures, this is a rather interesting world. You should know the laws around consigning pictures, and your dealer shouldn't mind if you register those pictures as your property and stand in line in front of any creditors that he has. That's a proper business relationship. So I don't know the laws here so well nowadays, and in those days it was a less complicated world. But today I consign pictures to dealers in New York occasionally. I always take out a UCC. I always register the picture when I lend it. No one's offended. They understand that's proper behavior and proper business.
But on top of that, I'm quoting David here. David told me the other day, don't expect your dealer to be your mother.
Yes, that's the other part of it, that you are an independent small business person, essentially. You're a center unto yourself, and you're responsible for yourself. A dealer doesn't want to have you phone every day to ask if the picture's sold. You might want to hang out at the gallery, though, and from time to time, because you actually like the dealer and you have things you want to talk about, and you might actually want to talk about your art, and he may want to talk about it, to understand what it is you're doing and what's motivating you to do it, and what it is that, there are a lot of levels of connection in the art dealer-artist relationship.
Where do artists go wrong, do you think, with their relationship with galleries? Besides the mother part.
Yeah, it's hard, because every artist is different in their personal behavior and every dealer. It's hard to generalize as to where it, but it does sometimes seem to go wrong. And there are basic human traits of honesty and behavior, but the truth is that artists have license. We've come to have romantic notions of people, and some people act those notions out. And some dealers are accepting of that, and some people feel if Titian behaved badly, you should fire him and go on with your life and do something else. So you may find that you have a dealer who has some personal dignity and expects respect to be treated as a human, and you yourself may have some of that dignity and want to treat people the way you'd expect to be treated. And then there are other people in the world.
Okay, we're looking at we're having difficulty seeing some of these slides, but these are some pictures that have come from your collection. And
so this is a Morris Louis.
Eleanor's put them together. Thank you so much, Eleanor, for doing this. But I have one question that occurred that I thought of this morning, which is, I've never asked you this, but a lot of you know David's principally working in the theater at this point, producing shows and so on. David also has a very keen interest in contemporary architecture. He's probably seen every ballet ever produced, right? And every play ever produced at least 10 times. But there's something about painting sculpture that captivates you, I know, in a way that nothing else does. I don't think any other form captivates you and interests you the way that painting and sculpture does. What can you say about that? Because I find that really interesting.
Well, I'm driven by curiosity. It's true. There was recently an interview with Frank Gehry by Charlie Rose, and he said to Frank, write a letter to yourself when you were a child and tell yourself what it's going to be that you need to know and what will happen to you to forewarn you if you want to grow into being Frank Gehry. And Frank starts it out with a picture of himself on a tricycle, and he says, next to your bedside, always keep a copy of Don Quixote and Alice in Wonderland. And I think that sort of is a statement about the wonder of the world and and being able to go off in places that you don't expect to go. And I think that's what the painting did. What I discovered that drew me towards these particular artists, as opposed to the pop artists where I'd started, was that in the world of the pop artists, I could immediately speak the language. There was a language that was a literal language. I had a familiarity with the subject matter. The subject matter of these pictures is paint. Is that the best blue? At one point, Frank Stella said, I opened the can of paint, and the paint never looked as good as it looked in the can. Could you ever make it look that good again? So here, the first picture we saw was an unfurled, a giant lateral picture with a lot of empty space in the middle and all the colors pushed out to the side. And the idea of pictures going across and staying abstract, often when you get a big horizontal picture, it turns into a landscape. So here's someone trying to be expansive and defy the landscape. And what I found over the years was that there was nothing better than the experience of accepting that an abstract artist makes his own language. And at certain times, he's interested in other artists. And so there's a dialogue between them in a moment. But often, the main subject, the main dialogue, is the language of that artist. So Rothko at the Phillips Gallery in a room of 4 Rothkos never looks better. And we really sort of came to Rothko through that experience and through the chapel that Menils did in Houston. So you begin to say, well, I go to Buffalo and I see a room full of Clifford Still, and he has his own space. If I go to the Hartford Athenaeum, I'll see that all these artists are in their collection. You'll walk into a room and you'll see a 1959 Frankenthaler with a 59 Gottlieb, with a 59 Morris Louis, with a 63 core picture of Olitsky, with a diamond Nolan from 63 Olitsky, 64 Nolan, and 5 open pictures by Bob Motherwell. And it adds up to pretty color on the wall if you don't actually have any experience of looking at those pictures before. So the ideal museum for me is a cluster of museums. It's a collection of individual groups of rooms dedicated to individual artists, where sometimes you bring those pictures together to tell some specific moment of discovery and challenge that exists between them. And I think that engaged me. And I found myself always being surprised, Dan, that I found that I'd walk into the studio thinking I knew what was going to happen next. I'd go to Olitsky's studio and pick the pictures off the floor, and I'd be shocked by them. They weren't what I expected, and I'd only take half as many as I wanted. And I'd come back on the next trip absolutely sure I was going to wipe out the studio, and he'd have moved on, and I didn't do it because my nerve froze and I bought half of it, and that's the excitement of being challenged all the time by the art.
Well, having said that, we're looking at these pictures which are now done by what we consider very famous artists. But at the time you were starting to deal with these people, they did not have the reputation that they've achieved today. We're talking about 50 years ago. A lot of these people were just starting their careers as you started to deal with them. So could you say something about that? I'm going to ask you then, it wasn't obvious to anybody at that point who was going to be a successful artist or a prominent artist or an artist who would contribute over a long period of time even.
Well, a long period of time is always a question. Will you survive the generation in which you're working? Will another generation come to still value what you've done? The most expensive thing we have isn't the art, it's the wall space. The AGO has 300 guards they have to pay for every day, and they have to pay for their wage. And so what are they willing to put on their wall? They're willing to put on the wall what you people here are willing to go look at. And because they want to know that people will come into their museum, and so they're trying to guess what will engage you. That's part of their job. And sometimes they'll take a chance on looking back. But in terms of contemporary living artists, they want to move on with what's going on right now. If Bowie was dead, you couldn't show him at the AGO. But because Bowie's alive, he's absolutely appropriate to this moment. And we've just seen him following an exhibition of Florence from 1300 to 1350. So something in Florence in 1300 to 1350 endured. The question is this a moment that's going to endure? The paintings that we're looking at behind us, they are in all the museums. They are being looked at and talked about again, and they were very much looked at, talked about for a period of 15 or 20 years. They came out of a change in atmosphere from the 50s and the 40s. The first generation of American abstract expressionism was traumatized by the war, and only towards the end of it did it begin to turn towards optimism. The 60s entered an age when someone once said, "Why can't a painting be a mile long?" And Gene Davis went out in the road and took a mile of road and painted stripes in Washington. So we thought anything was possible until Kent State and until all the assassinations and until the confusion of the 70s. So these pictures are about changing the world. They're about being free of having to talk about the war and about having to deal with the trauma of a moment in time and trying to deal with an eternity in the way that Impressionism does. They're paintings of light, and they're paintings of life. So that's the question. But they can't be seen in a book, and they can't be seen even on this screen. You actually have to stand in front of them, because there's a physicality to them that is part of their vocabulary.
How come I'm always on a ladder in these pictures?
Have we had a ladder shot of you up there?
We've had the ladder shot. No, I'm supposed to watch. Okay, we're going to watch the time. Yeah.
So this is transition poons. There are not any others that I've ever seen like it. He got the idea he was going to pour paint, but he hadn't figured out quite how he was going to pour paint yet. But you can, fortunately, the dimensions on all the pictures are there. And the need to paint big was there in that time. People did paint intimate pictures too. That need to make big pictures doesn't seem to be part of today. but there's nothing that stops anyone, and people do make big pictures. It just seems that that a lot of the things that were battles in the 60s have disappeared as battles today. Any medium can be used to make something now. I mean, Schwitter's opened the door in a way. Duchamp changed the rules to it. But in the end, what I end up looking for is I end up looking at Matisse. It still ends up drawing me. And yet, I find myself occasionally engaged now with film. I find myself engaged with other materials.
Architecture,
Architecture has become, something that always was engaging for me. But I think of Elan Etsui making his pictures or his work, which is partially sculptural. And Dan pointed out the other day, I was never afraid of sculpture. A lot of people tend to shy away from it in the 60s. But I sort of thought that color was coming off the wall into the middle of the room, and that it might even become more important than painting, and that sculpture was going to take over. Didn't quite play out the way we expected, but some great sculpture was made.
So a lot of these are installation shots from your gallery. David opened his gallery in 1963 and closed it in 1978, right?
Right.
So a lot of these shots are from exhibitions that we did. Some of you know that I worked for David full-time in the gallery in 68 to 70. And we spent virtually every day together in that period. We had, if I can say this, we had very few clients, very few sales.
But we had a lot of people come and look at pictures, and that was fun.
We had very
we would,
Okay.
We'd get a painter coming in, and we'd pull out all the paintings, and we'd argue about them and which way they should be going,
Okay.
how they were, drawn.
All
Sorry,
right.
Dad.
No, that's good. I wanted to go there because besides not having many clients and many sales, David thought that wouldn't even be possible until we had educated a generation of clients, collectors, interested, people who were interested. And so a lot of what we did, it's interesting that Paul used that word educator, because it really was a big part of what you were focusing on. I don't think people realized that at the time, but you always stressed to us how important it was to teach people about what you were doing.
Collecting in Toronto was European. If you were a wealthy person, you were going to collect, you could get a Kandinsky watercolor, or you could get a European artist from most of the dealers. I didn't quite get it. I mean, I was not a good businessman. I showed Milton Avery, and I showed the great late pictures that he did after the summer with Rothko and Gottlieb in '57. He'd been their mentor for 15 years before, but they hadn't seen each other for 15 years, and then he upped the size of his pictures. But a large picture of Milton's, he had passed away in '62, Sally Avery said, well, you can only sell these to museums. And I didn't know you had to actually phone the museum for them to buy it. They'd have to know you had it. Those were, or I'd have someone come in to see a Frankenthaler, and they'd say, I'd really like to have one of these pictures, David. And I'd say, which one? And they'd say, well, the one over there on the right. I'd say, that's a good choice. That's a really fine picture. It's not as good as the one to the left, but it's very good. That's not how you run a gallery. Don't go to a dealer like that. That's a bad choice. But I was trying to figure it out myself. Which one did I like? I didn't care which one they liked. That wasn't my problem. And bigger the better. And, well, bigger the better, where do I put my furniture? Well, you sit on the floor, get rid of the sofa. You have to understand, we never thought these paintings were going to be valuable in terms of money. We always thought they were going to be very valuable in terms of changing how we saw the world. So a Jack Bush at the time that he died was $6,500. So he'd had a great career, sold a lot of pictures, and he was making the living of a working guy.
Seeing all these shots of the gallery, are you missing this at all? Are you missing this experience of putting shows together the way we used to? Or?
Yeah, I think in some ways, seeing that photo of Reach a few minutes ago, that big blue sculpture that was all those thin strands, and seeing the dates on 65, 71. It's actually 65. There it is. Okay, well, the 71 came on because Tony looked at that piece in 71, and on the right-hand side of it, he wanted to put a plate that would float. And we bought the metal for him to add to it. And we were going to do it. We never got around to it. And then Tony looked at it a few years later, and he said, no, take it off. We're not going to put it on. The piece is complete the way it is. And we had it repainted, actually, under his supervision just before he passed away. So the piece really is a 1965 piece. The 71 never got attached to it. But there was never an end to the questioning, and there was never an end to what can we do to make it better, and what was better. Was it better in the end?
But you've maintained a relationship with almost all the artists you showed at that period. And I know that, I mean, we're painting this as a particular 63 to 78 period, but I know that this last year David went to the Venice Biennial and to Documenta, and you've stayed very current in the art world. So it's not just a historical moment for you, but you've continued your interest in looking, experiencing.
I'm curious about whether there are traces of this in the links going forward. The art world went off in various streams. In the 60s, there was a divide. In the 70s, the change in material that you could make art out of, there was a period when you couldn't paint on canvas and be taken seriously. And I don't think you could teach here at OCAD and be a painter on canvas in the 80s at a certain time.
It was difficult.
And so, now we sort of accept all materials and we say, what are we looking at in the end? But value judgments were very much a part of, and what you base value judgments on. If you don't look and don't have a context, it becomes difficult. There are some young people in these photos.
Those aren't us.
Oh, yeah. I think that Alex Cameron, who's upstairs,
See Alex up there.
is on one side here. And Alex was Jack's studio assistant in addition to, at that young age. But I think that if I don't keep looking, then I won't have a context. And so I find myself finding artists that engage me, but I still haven't found something I'm committed to in the same way. I've ended up with a piece by Tom Friedman because I think he's extraordinarily witty. I've ended up with some works by Elena Tsui, who I find is somewhere visually in a gap between Noland and Stella that I find interesting. And I look forward to having a space where I can sort of work with it, but I actually look forward to hiring some young curators. The model and seeing what they make of this and make of the art of their time. The model I like is the one where you've taught in the Venice part, the Florence part of the school here. And in Venice, the Peggy Guggenheim takes people who have graduated, or I think they've usually graduated, have they? And gives them an internship where they're properly paid so they can afford to live in Venice for 3 months and work with the collection, and they actually run the museum. And where I'm hoping this will all go is that the core of the collection will end up in a building that we'll do here with Frank Gehry, where I've essentially said to Frank, build me a road with 10 museums on it. And at the end of the road, build me a town square where we can all meet and talk. And I can put each of the artists in their own museum, but they can come out and talk in the town square. And so that's the concept of the 60,000 square feet I want to use for exhibition. But it means that you can see 80 or 90 of these works at any given time when you're in Toronto. And although the artists are to some extent Canadian and American and British, and there are roots in other countries where people responded to this art, no city yet has found the space to leave up 80 or 90 of these works, because the cost of those guards has always been too expensive. And that's why if you want to go to see minimalism, you can go to Marfa, Texas, and you can go to Dia Beacon, and you can now go to North Bennington to see Sol LeWitt. If you want to see pop art, it's of a scale that you can see it in a lot of places, and it's always up with full rooms. But there are not full rooms given to individual abstract artists of this generation, even though all of them are in all the museums.
So yes, what Dave was talking about is the building he's proposing for King and John Street, walking distance from here, will include a facility for OCAD University and a close, like I said before, a closer partnership between David and us.
I don't know if you've seen the collection of OCAD. I've never seen it, yet I know OCAD has collected since, for 126 years. So they'll finally have a place to put it out somewhere, and a place for the teachers to show, and a place for performance art, and all of that, and a place for curatorial studies and fine art history that I know goes on now, but also the opportunity to make use of my warehouses and my pictures to sort of see if we can come to some new ideas and therefore publish them and let them go out into the world. So it's a very nice relationship that is there that I hope will grow into something.
Well, it has grown into something. I just want to say one more thing. I know we have to watch the time a little bit, but oh no. Well, okay, you've all seen hair before.
We
we
look just the way we always did, don't we?
I'll be selling that belt later after the show.
That's why they said don't trust anyone over 30 and we're all going to die by then. We didn't do it.
All right, Paul, that's enough. Now, we promised people questions, but we have more stories, don't we? Do we have good?
No, let's do questions.
I have stories.
Oh, do a story.
No,
do a story.
All right.
Dan, I don't want
All right, okay. Well, okay, so there's the big mother well, Paul, the big blue mother well we had up there at some point. No, we had, as you can tell, David and I have had an amazing experience together in the art world. We've shared so much, and it's just been such a wonderful relationship. I was, just before we came in this morning, I was thinking back where, like I said, the gallery was pretty quiet in the early days, and
even in the later days.
Even in the later, and there were, besides David and I working in the gallery, there were two other people working. There was a director and a secretary, and they could never get up to come to work in the morning. So David and I were normally in the gallery 10 o'clock in the morning, whenever, in 9:30, 10, wherever we opened. And there wasn't a lot to do, so we used to study auction catalogs, and we would sort of have a competition to see who could get closer to predicting what these particular pictures would sell for at auction. And so we had a lot of time on our hands to read art books, and like David said, there's a lot of times where we were educating ourselves on the spot. We were young in the art world, decided we had to be in the art world, and really enjoyed being there, but we had a lot of education we had to catch up on, and we were able to share a lot of that. And just a couple of years ago, I won $100 from these American kids, remember, who were here that we played this game about getting the auction. And I beat these American kids each lost $5 to me, so. Do you remember that?
So our practice of the early days
right.
paid off, finally. Finally. It wasn't as bad as we're making it sound. We sort of ran the gallery for 15 years at break even. And the result was that these pictures are the leftovers. We sold about half the pictures, and half the pictures we ended up being able to keep. And we sort of broke even. It satisfied a need. The need was to actually physically be in front of the pictures and to see how they would feel, not just at the moment you were looking at it, but that was important, the moment you were looking at it, because that changed. Did you feel the same about it when you saw it a month later? You know, how did the picture hold up? What did you change? These were like people with relationships with us. And how do they look at this distance? Now, nothing is static. We accumulate information, we accumulate experiences, and we then come back and see things again and as if we'd never seen them before. So that was all part of it, and some of it's held up okay.
All right. Now, someone's supposed to be helping us with
What's
questions.
at the end of this? I'm wondering if there's a picture of the project at the end. If we went right to the end, Paul, would we end up there? No, I think you're going the right way. Yeah. 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 Is that the last one? Oh, we get white. Okay. Okay, well, Anthony Caro just passed away, but this is a pretty recent piece, and he's used plexiglass as a pool almost of blood in this piece. It's on the other side, I think, from where this photo's taken, so you can't see it. And Stella's been working in 3D printing in order to make the paintings that you see up above. But if you'd been at his Norton lectures at the Fog way back 25 years ago, these pictures now make sense. It was where he was driving.
Okay. Are you helping us? Oh, good. So we will take some questions, right, David? You okay?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Unless they're too hard.
Unless they're too hard.
Hi, I was wondering if you could talk about your decision to choose Frank Gehry. Did you have a short list, or did you know you wanted to work with him?
In 1971, I did an exhibition of a Californian artist named Ron Davis. And Ron had just built a house and studio, and he had a young architect named Frank Gehry. And I did a dinner for Ron, and they both came up here for that dinner. It was already a pretty radical building. It was in the shape of a tilted lozenge that was somewhat like one of Ron's paintings. Frank was very engaged with artists, but he wasn't Frank Gehry yet. Not till 1978, when he did his own house, did anyone pay attention to him. And so I watched what he did over the years, and there's a danger with star architects that they have a style, and what you're getting is the manner or the style of the architect. But architecture needs to function as a building. And so I would go to all of Frank's buildings over the years, and I stayed off and on in touch with him. And I found that the American Cultural Institute in Paris, which didn't have enough money to actually complete, you couldn't balance the heat in that building. It's not a successful building. I found other things that Frank did that were brilliantly successful, and he transformed all of Bilbao. And he had a client who didn't want a conventional art museum. That client wanted architecture to go with their Frank Lloyd Wright building in New York. It was the Guggenheim. But the actual showrooms on the second floor as gallery space was beautiful and very beautifully proportioned for classical pictures. So I saw a Malevich show in there that looked great. He redid the space in the Pasadena Art Museum, and you don't even see his hand. You haven't a clue that it's Frank Gehry. What you have is very appropriate space for the type of collection that they had. So Frank can be what you want if you're a good client who has an understanding of what you need. And he had gone through all the things that you had to know to make sure your building didn't leak. Also, technology changed in his favor. It went in a direction where you didn't have to do right-angle buildings. You actually could sculpt the building now. And so he began to work with types of programs that, in computers, that allowed him to do the things he wanted to do. And he had a success in building a 76-story apartment building in New York with 8 Spruce Street. So I waited for all of these things because I wanted a building that functioned. And when the AGO showed interest in dealing with Frank, Matthew Teitelbaum came to me and he said, "You know, Frank, what should I watch out for?" And I said, "Don't let him use any new technology he hasn't tested out on somebody else's building first. You don't want to be the groundbreaker." And when I turned to Frank, I said, what do I need to know? And he said, "It's a team, and Craig Webb will watch the details for you. Frank will get the proportions right." But the biggest sort of scare I had was, how would Frank deal with scale? Because Renzo Piano is the architect of choice for art museums today. And LA County has this big barn of a space that's great for Walter de Maria. You lay those pipes on the floor, and it doesn't matter how much sky you've got above it. But Frank had a friend who passed away who made small sculpture, Ken Price, who was a ceramicist. And he made big things for ceramics, but also small things. And Frank said he would install the show. And I thought, how's he going to do this in the Renzo Piano building? So I went out to look at it, and he had built a street with houses, with roofs, and sort of what we used to call as picture windows in the 60s, great big holes through the wall, and you could look in and you could walk around, and then there were cases in the street for the smaller pieces. He had created scale and made these pieces all make sense. And then the show moved to the Met, and it was a totally different type of space, and he adjusted it all, and he made it make sense there. So I think that's really why I chose him. I know there's a lot of heritage issues. I know there's a lot of, this was his home. He grew up here till he was 18. If you Google CBS Gehry, you'll see this Ken Rose piece. It's 4 minutes long. And you see everything about him came out of Toronto. This is where his parents took him to the Art Gallery of Ontario, and he decided that art would save his life, and that this would be his passion, that architecture with his teachers who pointed him in that direction would be a passion. He's a very interesting character who will tell you also what he thinks, which is good, so you don't guess. I'm really enjoying working with him.
Hey guys, I just want to thank you so much for a really interesting conversation, and I think the stories, I could listen to way more stories.
Yeah, I have more.
Yeah.
I'm saving mine.
You're saving them.
For the movie.
My mother was going to write the book, but she's not.
Maybe we'll have you back for some more. I just want to say I really liked the fact that you said that looking at pictures is not static as well, in that I think that's something important for our students, in that they will look at their own pictures and other artists' pictures, and in 5 years, maybe some of the ideas around those pictures will change for them, and I think that's a really big thing. And it sort of leads into my question. I was reading a recent Jerry Saltz article where he's talking about this return to minimalism and minimalist abstraction. And so he gives these examples of sculptural works in galleries where, for example, there's some bricks and then there's a metal pole that's sort of leaning against the wall. And he describes it as, a possible nod to the history of minimalism and abstraction, or that it's simply trying to mimic those strategies. And I'm just wondering if you've noticed any of those trends in terms of sculpture come back for yourself, David.
I see bits and pieces of everything, and I don't see the epic struggle. The 60s were clearer and the 70s were not. The 60s, came out of, the first generation of abstract expressionists struggled all their lives to find the one image that they needed, and a few of them transcended that. So you get Gottlieb going through pictographs on to bursts, to imaginary landscapes, but a lot of them were stuck. Rothko it's a mood rather than an evolution visually. And then you have a generation that come out of them, and more people are able to paint out of de Kooning than out of Pollock. And you get Michael Goldberg and Levine, Alfred Leslie, and a whole slew of Norman Bloom, a whole slew of second-generation painters who have learnt the mannerisms, of which Painters 11 was a part of, and some of the people in that have learnt mannerisms. And then you get to a crossroads, and the pop artists and the next generation, the color field artists, come out at the same time in reaction to all that. So there's a clear battle between high and low art. There's an actual placement of things. And out of the abstraction of that minimalism, you have Frank Stella sitting in the crossroads with a foot in pop art with his Day-Glow colors, with a place where he begins to paint in series, and Andy Warhol buys a group of 1961 Benjamin Moore pictures of Frank's, and for the first time begins to paint in series. So Frank affects pop art, he affects minimalism and is the father of it, and puts it in place, and the minimalists come out of that, and then he affects color field by sort of thumbing his nose at it with the irregular polygons and the Day-Glow pictures of the 67 to 70 interlaces. After that, everything becomes confusion. What that unusual conflagration of history creates is a battle, and therefore it's a fight between good and evil. And when you have epic battles, and Thor takes his hammer, and you have Siegfried, and you're dealing with a Wagnerian scale epic, great art comes out of it. And you have to be lucky enough to live in that age. If you don't live in that age, and you live in an age of great opportunity, but the field doesn't have Everest to climb, or the deep chasms of the ocean, you have to create them yourself. And there is room for the individual to do that. That's the reason we all do it. There's times you collaborate with people, there's all sorts of reasons for doing it, but the real value of the exercise is to prove the value of the individual. You can behave as well or badly in the daytime with your dealer or with other people. When you're alone in the studio, you're alone with yourself, and you're facing truth. So that's the time when you make whatever it is you make. Is it lunch?
No. Couple more.
David, it's Pixie here.
Yes.
I knew you in the middle 50s. We went to school together. And I always knew what I wanted to be. And you supported that idea. When did you finally, at what age were you that you decided that this was going to be your life, not as the artist and perhaps you are, I don't know that. But what struck you that you wanted to be part of this movement of art?
You know, I had a series of lucky accidents, but I think, Pixie, you and I probably shared something in having a teacher. You know, I think Bill Featherstone certainly made a difference. You know, Bill handed me stuff I shouldn't be reading, like the Foxes of Yarrow, of Yarby, of Foxes of Harrow. You know, it was, you know, pornographic novel of the antebellum, you know, 8th grade. You know, I was a bit of an outcast in the class, and I hung out with Nola Crew, who was also an outcast. She ended up being an alderman or a city representative and slugged somebody who was her opponent and knocked him off a bar stool, and had 8 kids, and turned into being a lawyer in one of the downtown firms. But used to go off with the kids on the motorcycles. You know, I sat in the corner and read Dumas and Thackeray. You know, people come out of strange circumstance and strange needs. And I was also lucky a little later on, I had a teacher, an English teacher, and I sat in the back of the class and read Rouault's History of Impressionism and Post-Impressionism. They both were published in '61. And, you know, I wasn't paying any attention to school. But I asked this teacher years later, he became head of drama at Ryerson, you know, why he didn't, you know, why let me just sit there. He said, well, I didn't have students who were really interested in something, and you were. You had something you wanted to learn about. And besides, you were passing my course. I didn't have to care about how you're doing with the other teachers. That was their problem. But my course you were doing well with, and, you know, and you were reading. You were reading the stuff that interested you. So I was about 16 at that point, and I guess a light had gone on. I think that there's the more complex way of seeing the world happens sometimes for some of us in our teens, some of us in our early 20s. But I think we begin to see the world in less simplistic terms. And we don't have all the answers. And when you don't have the answers, that's really good.
Yeah. Just a quick question regarding, so you've obviously looked at artwork your whole life, and I know Dan looks at a lot of student work every day, and I was wondering what advice you would give to a student transitioning from making a body of work in the classroom surrounded by people who always look at artwork, to a student maybe transitioning into a world where, you know, the general public doesn't maybe see artwork all the time like we do. How much do you justify to the people who aren't in the same world as you? How do you transition? What advice would you give to the students, like people in our position?
You mean, how do you become a socially acceptable human? It's tough. It's tough.
What advice would you give for that transition? That's what
I think you have to decide what it is you want to be. I think that it all comes from you. The actual mechanics of it. You know, Dan and I tried to talk about at the beginning about what's good behavior, bad behavior, what to expect from a dealer, what not. But ultimately, you have to know why you're making what you make and what drives you to make it, and why, you know, the core of it is really about you have a need. You have a need to do something. And once you've done that something, you may not have too much confidence in it, The need may be just to surprise yourself, to do something and not have it turn out the way you expect. I mean, the first stroke of paint that you put on the canvas is a mistake. That's why you put a second stroke next to it to fix it, till finally you get to the point where you have a painting. You know, you decide, I got there, I'm going to stop. Now, so now, you know, most painting up to the time of this stuff was made by people putting it on the canvas with their wrist. Almost all of these pictures are made with people's full bodies. They're pouring, they're throwing, they're doing things physically to make the pictures. But discovering something that makes you want to make the next picture or the next object or the next, or even the next thought, because it may just be something you're writing down on a piece of paper. Certainly a lot easier to trade in paper than it is to trade in big pictures. Conceptual art is the easiest marketplace of the world. We call them books sometimes, and sometimes we don't make them into books. But I think that it's in you, and if you're really driven to it, you'll find the way. But you don't have to justify it to other people, and you don't even have to justify it in the sense of doing something. If you have a place where you work, and you go there, you're entitled to sit on the stool and do nothing. That's your place. You can be true to yourself in whatever way you want, and nobody can intrude on that. You aren't obligated to anyone but yourself. Well, that's why you get out of school.
Anybody else want to do one more? Anybody else?
I'll be shorter. I won't be as...
That's good. Go, Paul.
So we go here and then we go.
Hi. You talked a lot about the new mediums and how it's important to always adapt to the new contemporary society. I'm wondering, what do you think about digital painting in the galleries nowadays?
About painting in the galleries?
Digital painting.
Oh, digital? The German movement of expressionist art?
Digital.
Oh, digital. Ah, okay, I'm sorry. That's what comes of age, hearing. Okay. Yeah, I have a friend who's making digital art, and I don't get it, but that's me. That's not her. You know, she's probably really good, and I just don't understand it. Someone's going to make something out of everything. Something good's going to, you know, it's not, you know, sometimes the material is just so good that you want to use that material. You want, you know, and I don't know, I don't have the answer. But I'm going to see something in digital art at some point. I know there's a lot of it out there. I haven't looked at a lot of it, but I've been forced to look at it because Tamsin Plant, who was the person who executed a lot of the Frank Stella work in my theater, is very caught up in it. And Tamsin developed maybe 1,000 ways to paint Frank Stella's paintings for him, including ways that Frank suggested to her.
But David has been adventurous, and he does own a piece that is made out of pins. So you have been experimenting with new media in some ways.
Yeah, I found myself in California looking at this square of pins. I didn't like the shape very much. I thought it was, you know, it's a square. But it was by Tara Donovan, and I did like the piece. I liked the idea that sculpture could be made using gravity. It just sat there and stayed in place.
And they're just little straight, what are those called, those pins?
Yeah, well, they were for hemming dresses.
Yeah.
The whole thing with Tara is that she takes everyday materials and uses them in some way that we didn't imagine and transforms them from something useful into something useless like art. And she did something that I thought was sort of magical, but I also thought it was interesting because it was a minimalist piece, and it was as close as I got to minimalism, and it was the exact same sort of, I saw it, sort of saw it somehow as relating to a painting by Frank Stella that I own called Polis Frampton that had an empty square in the middle of the painting. So now I had the square sitting in front of the painting that was there on the wall. The whole idea of shaped pictures really came out of Frank. And so somehow I found a way into the future. Now, Tara does drawings, but she never draws. So I'm always sort of puzzled by it. And eventually I bought a drawing by her, but they're really bubble sewed, bubbles of ink that she blows into a straw and then drops on my line that eventually dries. But they are drawings because she chooses where to put the ink and how to put it down. So people surprise you. I wouldn't in a million years, if you would describe these two things I just described, imagine me ever buying. So
you do, so surprise still is a big part of it for you.
Yeah, I don't
Okay.
know why.
All right, let's do one more. I know we're getting late. Paul wanted, I know Paul, I promised Paul earlier. Then I forgot. I'm sorry, Paul. There he is.
As a collector and an art dealer, what is it that brings you the most pleasure?
You know, well, it's nice to get stumped. I think you stumped me. Yeah, look, I love sharing this stuff. So I love it when a class comes in and I love to listen to the teacher and hear what they have to say about it. But I love being alone with it. You know, I love being alone, and I love sort of, just being surprised by it, because I can be around it for a long time, and see it quite differently than, you sometimes you walk by things, they're your friends, and you're close to your friends, you know all your friends. I'm talking about people. And then something they say, or some, way you see them differently, all of a sudden makes them more interesting again, new again. So I've just been to New York, and I've seen a couple of Morris Louis stripe paintings, small vertical stripes. And they've renewed the one I have at home. I see it differently than I saw it a week ago. I see it, I'm paying attention to it in a way I didn't. This gentleman just up behind you that wanted to ask something. Yeah.
I don't know, Mike. I have a loud voice. This just comes out of like just pure excitement for your new space. It's like I saw the paintings once in the East End, and this like changed me. You speak of the different rooms in the town hall at the very end. And I'm wondering if you are going to like invite younger artists to sort of talk to the town hall of your paintings, like invite others.
I don't know what this museum will be. I know that I want to create a destination with the building itself. I think that it will bring more attention to the university because of Frank's architecture. I think it will bring more attention to these pictures because of that. I think that the individual space of those artists is important to me. But then the question is, we live in another time. And I want to go backwards and forwards in that time. And yes, I suspect at some point we'll put younger artists in. But at the moment, there are things that we don't see in Toronto. There was a Switter's exhibition of collages the Menil Museum sent out. The AGO can't afford to do that show. Yeah, I'm not criticizing them. I'm saying they do a wonderful job, and we see great things there. But that show cost $500,000 to do, and only 5,000 people would have gone to see it. And they wouldn't have been able to pay for the costs of running a big encyclopedic museum with that exhibition. There was an extraordinary exhibition called American Vanguard a year ago that went through the United States. It couldn't possibly come to this country because you couldn't justify the number of people who would come to see it. I believe I can have a museum that, one, doesn't have to charge admission, because I'm going to try and find a way within the structure of this building to make it free. We may have to charge for special exhibitions, but two, can do that American Vanguard show. So it can talk to a piece of history that there isn't a giant audience for, and at the same time, I think is important if you want to understand the context of where things we're looking at today come from. So I have gaps I want to fill in, but eventually I'll have to look at contemporary art or nobody will come. The biggest audience is for the art that's being made in your own time. It always is.
Well, Paul Slogan, he's a very eager student, Paul Slogan. He's going to get a really good mark, too.
I have one more question.
Do they still have marks?
And it's in regard to this slide that's behind you. Could you tell us the story about these pictures?
Ah, this and that. Okay. So this and that were once one painting. It was a single canvas, and at a certain point, quite early after Ken painted it, I think he showed it once together and then decided to cut it in half. So why did he cut it in half? I always thought that one side receded and the other went back, went forward, so that they were pulling apart, which may be part of it. And you look at them together and I think you might feel that way. And that they also stood strongly on their own as individual paintings. But I think, why did he paint them together is also an interesting question. I think he painted them together because Ken was always interested not only in color but in motion and speed. And I think he tried to set them to spin visually. But I think he also, in setting them to spin, was looking to create a horizontal view to the pictures. Again, that question of the landscape. Can you make a horizontal that's abstract and not a landscape and doesn't fall into becoming one? And so it was a picture that was pulling apart. And in the end, I think he thought it was better to cut it. And he had two pictures. But I think that the idea of making a wide, big picture was an interesting and compelling idea. It would have been interesting if he'd made one with 4 circles. You know, we're now far from the time. Everything gets digested and patted down and made easy to digest. Difficult ideas, difficult experiences. We like to make those things all become simple. And I think that there were pictures at the same time as the circles, which were crosses, which were V's that pack. I mean, he experimented with a lot of different formats. And we, the public, who look at art, decide the circles were the great paintings. And so, and for certain reasons, they were. There's more range of what you can do. You can quantify how much blue against how much yellow, and how, you can change the size of those bands. There's more flexibility for him to be creative within this format. And so he honed down to something in the end, then pushed it. This is 58, 59, and he paints circles through to 62. So a lot of experiment, a lot of change in that period of 4 years. Is that any good? Yeah. Possible?
Let's thank David very much for coming to visit us.
Thank you. It was fun for me.